We are seeing that there's a variety of approaches to our topic of welcome and inclusiveness in this morning's presentation, and I am going to talk about a movement that I think rests on what Dr. Miller told us about in the VUCA world of volatility and uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity, a reaction to that. 3 years ago, a book entitled Jesus and John Wayne caught the attention of our national conversation about the influence of religion on culture and politics. Dr. Kristin Dumais' subtitle of her book, she teaches at Calvin College, was even more provocative: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Our UMARC steering committee members have talked about this book, several of us equally concerned about a current warning from Dr. Dumais about a phenomenon she has identified, a related phenomenon. She's written about it, been interviewed about it: white Christian nationalism. Our concern has been that this very prevalent movement and point of view have provided a sinister and dangerous foundation for the racism and homophobia that our group has been so concerned about in our 7 years of existence. We'll be viewing in a moment one of Dr. Dumais' videos on this topic, but let me offer a brief context and definition. One of the most accurate definitions I know of was by Reverend Dr. Jerry Frantz, who is a UCC pastor, retired now, who has served congregations in California and Florida. His definition of Christian nationalism is this: it is the belief that the American nation and our identity as Americans is defined by Christianity, and that the government should take active steps to keep it that way. Well, one immediate problem, he says, is whose definition of Christianity we should adhere to. Is it the Christianity that supported slavery during the pre-Civil War period and the Jim Crow era that followed? Is it the Christianity that condemns the LGBTQ plus community as being deviant and immoral? Is it the Christianity that would close our borders to immigrants, especially to those of a different religious affiliation? Or is it the Christianity that welcomes cultural and religious diversity, a faith that welcomes all people, as Jesus did? Is it a Christianity that zealously supports social justice for all, particularly for the least of these, the poor and marginalized of the earth? I would add, is it a Christianity that wants to establish a practice to prescribed prayer, a government-sponsored way of praying? And if so, who writes the prayers? Christian nationalists, he says, who are overwhelmingly white, think they are privileged and that their privileged status comes from God. And this sort of thinking has a long history in white evangelical Christianity. Well, that's one definition in one context. The issue of Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism is addressed by other notable theologians, Episcopal priest and theologian Dr. Carter Hayward, in her book, The 7 Deadly Sins of White Christian Nationalism, says this early on: one of the most significant and prescient values enshrined by the founders of our nation was that the American colonies would have no official religion. In other words, America would not be a Christian nation, even though most of its leaders were white Christian men. December 15, 1791, the framers of our democratic republic crafted the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, in which they signaled an official distance between the government of the U.S. and the beliefs and moral practices of Christians and other religious believers. She says, still throughout our nation's history, many white Christians with traditional, conservative values in realms of family, race, culture, gender, sex, and the economic rights of individual white males have sought to bring American law and values, the whole of American culture, I should say, into alignment with their own religious values. Dr. Diana Butler Bass, in a 5-page article on her Substack, July 29th, writes, the harder forms of Christian nationalism have always been ugly expressions of exclusive national identity, accompanied with violence against Jews, Catholics, Blacks, and Asians. It has conflated ethnicity, Protestantism, particular notions of masculinity, and a crusading spirit into a toxic political stew. Dr. Bass goes on to take a more nuanced position when she makes these two statements. One, America is not a Christian nation. Secondly, the United States is shaped by Christianity, particularly Protestant Christianity. I think her complex formulation deserves more time than we have today, but it's one part of our overview. And taking a look at her label of a harder form of Christian nationalism, one that is exclusive, dangerous, and leads toward authoritarianism, Dr. Heather Cox Richardson, professor of American history at Boston College, whose daily newsletter has an audience of hundreds of thousands of readers, says in her October 30 newsletter, she identifies GOP leader Mike Johnson as a, quote, Christian nationalist who, with his colleagues, seems to be pushing an extremist agenda, perhaps in the context of his evangelical or fundamentalist theology that demonizes LGBTQ plus persons and wants to make our country into a Christian nation. One more example of the contemporaneity of our topic. Washington Post writer Jennifer Rubin said she finds it frightening how one American political party has bought into the white Christian nationalist movement, a racist ideology, she says, that rejects the basic premise of our democracy: all men are created equal. In addition to these writers and theologians, Dr. Dumais herself has been interviewed and written on her Substack about our topic of the morning. She's given us permission to use her videos in our webinar. The one we've chosen is her participation in a panel discussion sponsored by the Public Religion Research Institute as well as the Brookings Institute. And here is that video. I heard some pretty sobering words from the reporter who called and said, I've read in the Bible about Jesus, but I don't see what could be Christian about this movement. And from Professor Dumais herself, this movement is a real threat to democracy. I'm sharing a bit of the reading I've done in preparing context for today and a bibliography that's on our website under the title of additional resources. I've also got a study guide there that will include reading suggestions like this book, The Flag and the Cross. Sorry, it's blurred for you, by Gorski and Perry. All of that's in the bibliography. And then there's this lapel pin, which you may not can see, which is a cross covered over by the American flag. Bought this in North Texas, visiting there a few years ago. I think your reaction to the lapel pin might be a good measure of whether you consider what your relationship is to the topic of Christian nationalism. Is this an appropriate description of the relationship in America between patriotism and Christianity, or would you share the reaction from one of our UMARC members recently who said, who saw this lapel pin and said Christian nationalism is an oxymoron? Two words that contradict each other and don't fit together. What do you think? Thank you for your participation this morning. I commend the study guide and the reading list that is available on the UMARC website.